welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is the first event in a series of philosophy public lectures, science and humanities in the public imagination, contemporary and also past historical imagination. I suppose a big question we want to address across the three events is, what do we want from our science? What do we want from humanities, and how do we want them to communicate to each other? Do we still have a culture split or not? Each sort of event will try to tackle this very big general sort of question via different angles, and today we have Richard Harvey joining us from the School of Computing Science and Nancy Roberts joining us from Umbrella Academics to talk about a more human AI. And as a philosopher, I want to kind of just put out there a big question to them. We as humans kind of make lots of errors and kind of think that doing mistakes, it's part of what makes us human. It's part of the charm. We kind of learn from them. We also pay very dearly for them. Sometimes by regretting those mistakes, other times because we see the harm that we produce, other times because society tells us we made big mistakes and punishes us. But these types of accountability that humans have for their mistakes seems to be different from the kind of accountability AI systems have. So, should we hold AI systems to the same standards as humans, or should they have different standards? So, I know Richard had quite strong views about this, so I'll kind of invite him to start our conversation this evening.
Yeah, thanks, Maria. Well, let's start, I suppose, with an observation, which is we do hold computer systems to higher standards than those of humans. So that would be my first assertion. I hope that's not up for debate. And I think it is, certainly in the profession, the conventional wisdom is that we should do that. So if you're designing a aircraft control system, I think the expectation would be that you have a set of rigorous design checks on the system that you design, and you use technology that is what's called provable, so that you can go from an algorithm to a program to a system and be relatively confident that the system is doing what you hoped it should do. So that would be a very conventional sort of safety critical system view, which is, and of course that is considerably higher standard than you would hold the pilot. You would assure yourself of the pilot by training him or her and testing them regularly, but you wouldn't ask a brain surgeon to open up their brain and check that their brain was working in the right way. Right? However, I don't think that's going to work as we move towards AI that encroaches on a human position. And I think the problem with it is it creates a possibility of undercutting the machine response with humans. So you can end up with systems that are intrinsically worse than the systems we could be building because we are insisting on these lower standards for humans. So I think it's a slightly contrary position we've ended up in. It's perfectly reasonable that we should have started like this, by the way. When your calculator's job was just to add numbers, it's not unreasonable to insist that it adds numbers as accurately as could possibly be achieved with the technology you've got, and certainly quicker and more accurately than I can do.
So Nancy, would you agree that kind of actually the standards that we apply to AI systems are stricter? And
I think it really depends on what standards you're talking about, and of course the devil's always in the detail with these things, isn't it? But I think Rich is right. We do hold a lot of technology to very strong account on certain measures, so accuracy, repeatability, performance, those types of measures. The question comes around the other standards that we might hold humans accountable to. So obviously we have legal systems which are intended to encourage or deter certain types of behaviour. The reality is That doesn't stop people from doing things which are against the law, and it equally doesn't necessarily incentivize people to conform to the law if it doesn't suit their personal circumstances. I think the other question, and the question which gets the most debate probably in my sort of part of the AI world, is around the morality of AI, the ethics of AI, if you like. So, you know, the classic example of the Tesla who knocked over and killed a woman, the argument there was around the fact that had it been a human in the car, they would have made a decision based on the fact that this was another human and that they had a responsibility not to kill that human. The Tesla treated that question very differently, which was, what is this object? What is the size of the threat? Who's most likely to be damaged if I collide with this object? Is it me or is it the human? I'm simplifying, obviously. But so that's the question we need to ask. And I think what I see a lot is people saying, how do we inject morality into AI systems? How do we inject ethics into AI systems? And so things you talked, Maria, about, you know, as a human, we learn from our mistakes. That's part of the learning process. You know, we start learning to walk, we stick our fingers in an electrical socket, we get an electrical shock, we learn that we don't want to do that again, and that's part of the process of education that we go through. I think the question we need to ask is, do we want AI to be behaving in that way? Or do we accept that it's doing something different and that therefore different kind of questions apply? So for me, you know, if we continue to believe that to fix the problems that AI causes, you know, the narrative that we're all aware of AI systems making strange and terrible decisions and biased decisions and stuff, which are real issues, and I'm sure we'll come on to talk about those, but the question is the way to fix that to make them more like humans? Or is it something different altogether?
Yeah, so interesting, the fact that kind of we rise from kind of standard in general, kind of to moral standards, and kind of one question that comes out of this is, do we apply our sort of moral standards to machines, or do we kind of need to rethink kind of our morality? Because look, if these are completely different systems from humans, maybe we should kind of have their kind of special morality as special laws. What do you think, Richard? Different laws, different moral laws, or just different?
I'd rather start from a different position. So my worry is, humans aren't very insightful about what they're doing anyway. And so asking a machine to match the ethical behaviour of a human makes me cringe, because when we haven't been very good at categorising human behaviour. And a point I would just like to sort of throw out there is, you might say, well, why bother, you know, it's a lot of faff. If we don't bother, then we're going to be in a very tricky position with AI as it starts to approach human activity. It is inevitable there will be a benchmark against human activity, and that benchmark will fail on a rather linguistic point, which is we never really sorted out what this human activity was meant to be in the first place. So that bothers me a bit.
I want to pick up a question. It's good that you put it like that, because in a way I think our sort of intuitions that we should somehow apply the moral standards or kind of the general standards from humans, is we kind of think we understand humans better. Like I was thinking what Nancy was saying. So, you know, we know how children learn. We know how we do mistakes. We know about biases and heuristics nowadays so much. So it kind of feels like we know these standards because we know humans. And there is all this sort of speech nowadays that we don't really understand how AI system works. Is that even right? Do we understand how they work?
I'm sort of violently disagreeing with you there, Nancy. I'm not saying, we understand how people make mistakes. We jolly well don't understand how people make mistakes, and they keep making them.
That I completely agree. I was just, you know, making the point that there is a school of thought that if we can get AI to learn in the way that humans learn, for example, it becomes closer to something which would have a morality or a kind of worldview that is closer. I agree with you. I don't think we are very good at understanding humans.
I hope I'm not sort of sucking up to the audience here, but I mean, there is quite a case for thinking even more carefully about how humans, why humans do the things they do. And my point is, not only is this rather sort of it's typical of humans to be interested in themselves, a very self-centered lot that we are. But this has a spin-out benefit, which is technology will get a lot better. Technology doesn't really work with ill-defined and vague definitions, does it? It would be so much easier if there was an algorithm for learning, human learning, or the act of, well, you were talking about driving a car.
Or making a friend, or anything
exactly.
that humans do. Yeah.
So there's a it feels very imperative at the moment to think about that. When it didn't feel like that when I started my career, because what I was working on was so distant from human performance and human kind that you thought, we can kick it down the road.
Yeah, and I think, what you were saying, Richard, a minute ago about the fact that we have to be aware of how much we might constrain the potential of these systems as well. It's something that we need to be mindful of. So, we know that there are AI algorithms which can, for example, detect breast cancer in an earlier stage than human radiographers can, statistically speaking. Do we want to stop the potential for systems to develop those types of solutions? And is putting human morality into them the way to do that? Or is it just going to constrain behaviours around certain expectations of what is right, rather than what might be something that humans can't see, or can't see as well, or is at the same scale, or at the same speed, or with the same level of accuracy?
So it's a beautiful dichotomy within computer science, this actually. If you think about the breast cancer example, the safety critical systems people say, we're not having any machine learning in it, we want it all provably correct, and the consequence of that is it's no good, right? It doesn't really work. If we go down the machine learning route, we can end up with these incredibly effective systems, better than humans, and we're going to deprive ourselves, people are going to die rather than we use effective systems.
Yeah, agreed.
But they've got to, there are questions about those systems which are very effective. And, one hates to, it always seems to be, every time we get into this debate, we always have to end up dealing with companies like Tesla, Facebook and Google that just make you want to vomit with their ethical positions. But I suppose it's good that they're involved because they bring things into sharp relief.
But do you think these examples sort of control the narrative about AI systems? So in a way, it's like kind of more interesting sort of examples, let's say in kind of medicine, medical practice, or like they don't get enough exposure. So it's kind of, so if we're talking here about the utility of AI systems, like you feel, the shiny examples, like the Tesla cars, all this kind of thing that Facebook is doing with machine learning is kind of stealing the stage, as it were. And people don't get to hear about actually useful AI systems, and we get actually this sort of vilified image of AI systems, and then we get into the moral questions, and then we get this sort of kind of a bit stoppers in the debate.
Yeah, those companies are a problem. And I think they're a problem, nothing to do with AI. They're a problem because their business model is that you give them data and then they use it for free and they give you free stuff.
Yep.
I don't like that model. I've never liked it. I don't use them. Okay, I use Facebook a bit. But it's only because the village group is on Facebook and I can't.
There's always a group
I need to know when the jumble sale is,
quite.
But you get my point.
Yeah.
But if we think about, let's think about AlphaGo. Remember AlphaGo? So it was a beautiful system designed by, I've forgotten his name, but he was a Brit based at UCL. And it was one of the first systems to really be very effective at Go. And if you remember, it beat the international Go champion.
Yep.
And the critical move was move 43 in one of the games. And it made this move that was wild and crazy. You can see it on YouTube. It's a really wonderful thing. And all the commentators, there was complete silence when it made this move. Everyone went, wow, that is like an interesting move, people were saying. And then there was the Korean guy going, that is it's just a bad move. He said, why is it bad? I don't know, it's just bad. It's weird. And in came Lee Sedol, who was the champion, and he looked at this and his whole face just went, what are you doing? He was puzzled by it. So backstage, they were able to interrogate AlphaGo and said, well, tell me about this move. And AlphaGo not only knew that this would be a puzzling move, it would be a move that no human would ever make. it managed to put probabilities on the chance that it would be made by a human. So it knew perfectly well that it was going to confuse Lee Sedol, who was the champion. That was a very long answer to explainability is really a fascinating aspect of modern AI, and it's a really hot topic for all of us. Now, I should just gently say that the sort of explainability standards we're demanding out of AI are rather more than those that we demand out of humans, but let's not dwell upon that. Well, not philosophers, they're a different breed, but ordinary mortals like me are not asked to explain why did I make the tea that way. But AI will be. So we're in this funny sort of melange of bad things happening with experimental systems, you mentioned some, and then the future, which looks much more explainable and much more regularised, but I worry is going to be held to standards that are inappropriate.
So can you kind of tell us why are exactly these standards inappropriate? Because they are human standards? Because they are kind of higher than the human standards? Like, can you give us an example of how these higher standards can go wrong?
Yes. Just before we came on, I was talking about the AI Act in the EU. So the AI Act is a proposal from the European Union to regulate AI. And the idea is that you will categorise AI into prohibited systems. You should not produce those, obviously. High-risk systems, and I think there's medium and low risk, but let's not worry about them. Prohibited system would be automatic biometric identification in a public place. That will be prohibited under the AI Act. Okay, but we're already doing that with humans. So if the cops want to find someone, they will flood Liverpool Street Station with police and they will look for a known criminal. It's quite a dangerous thing to do if it's an armed criminal because those sort of people tend to shoot back. Whereas the proposal, which is a set of cameras automatically looking for the criminal, will be illegal, at least in the EU. That sounds like a bad... There's a rather sharp example.
Can you, talking about kind of going in, kind of behind this sort of motivation, why there is a lot of support for banning system like that, is kind of prohibiting that? What do you think is kind of the main motivation driving that?
Well, what do you think?
Well, I think it goes back to something you were touching on, Maria, about the narrative around AI. And of course, we all... it's fascinating to read these horror stories of the systems that have gone bad and, started making terrible decisions, or, the Twitter bot that started posting, very, very quickly sank into kind of very racist comments and things like that. I think we've got a kind of double-pronged problem there, and I come from a humanities background. I'm very interested in stories, and I think stories are a large part of what makes people human. And the story around bad AI is quite an appealing one, right? It's been in the popular imagination before we had AI. We thought there were ghosts in the machine or whatever you want to call it. So there's an appeal to that kind of story. But we've also got AI working behind the scenes to create news and information that goes out into the world on the basis of what will get the most clicks, what will be the most retweeted, what will drive traffic to my company, if you're Google or Facebook, what Facebook story is going to get the most traction, that's going to bring people to Facebook who might not otherwise be there, that I can then sell something to or take some data from. So we've got kind of two problems here. We've got a narrative about AI which is quite appealing and kind of resonates with people. Machines are bad, robots are going to kill us, iRobot, whatever you want to call it. This is not a new narrative in a sense. We're just talking about a different type of technology. But we've also got the problem of what AI is doing around how people receive information when, the motivation is very different potentially from a human creating an independent news channel, for example, who has this great motivation to share the truth about a story. Now, there's a whole other, obviously, discussion around that, to Rich's point about what is the truth about this story and who is this person to define that for us.
That human narrative is really fascinating. Just to prepare myself, I thought, well, I'll go back to RUR, so the word robot first appears in this weird play by Karel Čapek called Rossum's Universal Robots, 1920s. Sort of thing you put on when you're a student,
Yes.
You don't have to wait long for the first press story after that from Killer Robots. McCulloch and Pitts, the perceptron.
Yeah.
How long did we have to wait from that before a scientist design thinking brain? It was mad. And it's all my life we've had this hype cycle. So something gets discovered, it's a bit brain-like, masses of press interest, money flows in, enormous amounts of money, big disappointment, and then we slide down the other side.
Yeah.
This debate, you've always got to keep that in mind, what's going on in the hype cycle.
But returning to the AI Act, kind of that the European Union is pushing, is like one would believe that kind of policymakers are a bit above the sort of general narratives, aren't they? So in a way, they aren't controlled by them. So they should be. You have all these sort of experts understanding what AI can really do. So then, kind of weighing what should be prohibited, what shouldn't, should not be so influenced about this narrative. So is there kind of some security, are there some security constraints that you think are motivating them, or is just, again, something having to do more with kind of...
Well, the AI Act is a bit of a puzzle. I mean, I can't decide if it's just bad drafting.
Okay.
Well, it could be. And one test of that is, I work in AI, so could I drive a coach and horses through it? Yeah, I'm convinced I could. So it might just get sorted out with drafting, right?
Yeah.
But I do think it's a bit weird to start... It shows a sort of poor thinking to think about prescribing the way of doing something, not the something. It just feels very odd, that. And the only answer I can give is that because so many bad things are already legal in the various European states, they just couldn't bring themselves to make them illegal. So they said, well, we're not going to make matters worse by allowing AI to do lots of things.
Okay,
so
interesting.
I think that must be the sort of political thinking behind the AI Act.
That kind of brings me to kind of the other question I wanted to ask about the difference between human error and AI error. So in a way, maybe it might be trivial to say, or not, AI systems make very different kind of errors than humans. I don't want to kind of jump on an example. Maybe kind of any of you has an example that would be kind of striking, the type of error that an AI system would make and a human would never?
There's a thing going around at the moment. Sorry, I don't want to dominate conversation, so jump in. But there's a thing going around at the moment called data poisoning. So stop sign recognition is an important task, particularly if you've got a Tesla, right? And so the question... data poisoning comes after this. The first question is, can we fool AI, well-trained AI looking for stop signs, into recognizing stop signs which are not stop signs? Yeah, turns out to be quite easy. What's shocking to us humans is that some of those images look nothing like stop signs. And it's a simple search to find such things. I should have brought some and put them up. But you'll have to trust me. You look at them and how did they make that mistake? It doesn't look anything like it. And, it's a consequence of poor training and poor generalisation, all the usual sort of stuff. So obviously that raises a fascinating idea, which is many of the systems that we're using every day are trained on publicly available data. So if you are using, let's pick the one that was controversial. Google Photos had a system that would identify people in it. This is so horrible that I'm a bit nervous even to mention it, but I will mention this error because it will make you cringe. But the first generation of Google Photos was unable to tell the difference between black persons and gorillas. It was eye-wateringly embarrassing at best. Right? It was a total cringe. Now, how did that happen? They just downloaded I don't know, but I'll make a guess. They downloaded a standard research network, which was never designed for that purpose. They thought, hey, this is cool. We'll apply it. Typical Google, move fast and break things. And that's what happened. And it was a bomb had been set up, of course. It was a complete nightmare. But once you know that, of course, if you're a malign actor, you will start to put stuff into databases to get the outcome you need. So if you want ChatGPT to write a certain way, I would recommend corrupting the data that it uses because it retrains. That's called data poisoning. That's one of the consequences of doing that. And just to flick back to your question that you asked, given that we're triggering these errors by data that doesn't look to humans very much like the target, you can poison in quite subtle ways with current systems. So you can add what looks like just garbage, and you think, well, the engineers won't spot it to be quite so dangerous as it is.
Any other kind of examples that kind of might look sort of to motivate this sort of distinction between AI error and human error, kind of from your experience?
Well, I think we data poisoning is the kind of extreme end, isn't it? In some ways, the challenge we have is that anything that you train on data which has been generated by humans is going to be riddled with those human problems, issues, all of those things, which is why we see this kind of racial bias in lots of systems. It's why we see gender bias in lots of systems, insurance and healthcare systems, and people, figuring out who's most likely to be a criminal. There's lots of evidence of sort of things like racism and gender bias in those types of systems. But the reality is that often that is coming from human bias. And I think that the challenge we've got is how do we figure out where the one ends and the other begins?
There's probably people are probably aware of this, but when you build a classification system, it has these sort of multiple sections. You usually do some pre-processing of the data, then you have the big AI bit, which usually nowadays is a deep learning system. Then there's a very important bit that goes on the back, which people never talk about, but it's the cost bit. It's where you evaluate risk of making a wrong decision. And that cost matrix is quite well developed in humans, and very often in research systems we don't bother even setting it because it's the user problem. We say, well, I worked for a long time on torpedo alarms. So if you're on a submarine, you're very interested in whether someone's fired a torpedo at you. It's extremely interesting to you. So you have to decide what the cost of a false alarm is. And you might say, a false alarm, well, whatever, at least you're safe. Believe me, a false alarm is a disaster.
Okay.
Well, because you've got 250 people who need stress counselling after it. When the alarm goes off and it's a false alarm, you're in tears of worry. So you cannot have it going off every night. So the costs are very, very important on these things. And the racism example was the costs hadn't been applied at all. So I think there might be something there which is... But again, just to flick back to my earlier point, how do you decide what the cost should be for misclassification? You better understand humans, and you better understand the context. And you should understand that some of those errors that the Google system was making, for example, are very much more expensive in the US, which has an obsession with race, for example. In the UK, we have different obsessions. So the cost matrix is very human-driven.
I was thinking kind of about this distinction while I was kind of preparing for the session I've always been convinced that there is a big difference between how AI systems and human systems work. But nowadays we see more and more kind of this problem we are facing, how do we deal with misinformation? So we talk about, in AI system, we talked about data poisoning. Someone with kind of bad intent comes and poisons your data because wants a certain outcome. But nowadays we have kind of these waves of information. And as humans, we might be good in smaller contexts to figure out what's the truth and what's kind of false. But nowadays it's become harder and harder to kind of separate misinformation from information in this sort of sense. So and we might end up doing certain errors like AI systems do because we cannot filter, because our data is poisoned, because our information is poisoned. So maybe there is also this other way so we become obsessed with some problems the AI systems have. but maybe there's something to learn from them about kind of human error. So would you say there is kind of this back and forth? So rather than seeing always humans as the answer, you know, for correcting things, is there a way to see AI systems? What kind of?
Yes.
Not surprising from you, Richard.
Yes and no.
Okay, I'll go for yes and no first.
I mean, I think that, you know, the issue with any system or any technology is the risk. What are the consequences of what this system or this piece of technology could do? And, you know, the supplementary question, you know, so just because you know how to build an atom bomb, should you build an atom bomb? Just because you know how to create an AI system that can, you know, in inverted commas, make human decisions, should you do that? The question is always, what uses are we going to put that to, and what are the consequences of those? So, to me, it's always going to come back to humans and what they want to do with those systems, as imperfect as humans are at making all of these decisions and the biases that we all know that we have and all of these issues that we're discussing. I think it's incumbent on us as humans to say, it's not so much what's the system doing, what's the morality of the system, or what's the, you know, what standards should we hold the system to. It's what standards should we hold ourselves to in our interaction with these systems. The system themselves is, you know, is not the problem in a sense. It's what we then do with that. And you know, that talks to that point about risk. You know, are we prepared for, you know, to go back to our Tesla example, because it's just an easy one to sort of get your head around. Are we prepared for the occasional person to be run over by a Tesla if we know that they prevent X other accidents? Most people would, well, I don't know what people would say, but certain people would say no, one death from that system is too many. Other people might say the needs of the many versus the needs of the few. You know, and that's where the debate needs to be, I think, about those kinds of things. I think the issue that creates some of this bad narrative or this kind of vilification of AI is really around that. So in the examples of, you know, bias in recruitment systems, Amazon hiring men because the system looked at who they'd hired in the past and what, you know, made those connections, you know, that was probably predictable, and if not predictable, it was certainly very quickly very obvious. The question is then, what do you do about it? Do you go, well, humans are biased, we've made AI that's biased, them's the breaks? Or do you say, this is an opportunity where we could maybe do something different and hold ourselves to a higher standard with the outputs of the systems that we're creating? And that, to me, is the interesting conversation. So I think, you know, as you were saying, Richard, it's not really about what standards are we holding the systems to in those terms, those regulatory terms. It's about what's the consequence on us, having defined those standards, however we as humanity decide to define it, which will be imperfect, no doubt, because humans are. But we have to live in the world that we create, and that puts a moral responsibility on us, I think, as humans, to consider what risk we're prepared to accept, what benefits we're prepared to accept, because of course the potential of AI systems is that just as much as we can feed them bias, we can also use them to remove bias or reduce bias, because they don't come with all the things that humans come with, their background, their political values, their family experiences, their upbringing, you know, all of the things that make us the beautiful, wonderful, individual people that we all believe ourselves to be. Systems don't have that unless we give it to them, in a sense. So as much as we can build a system which replicates human bias and says women should not be employed by this company because the system tells us so, we could equally build systems, which is what we're working on, to say we don't need to do that. What we need to identify is, why was that human bias in place, and is that valid in the context of why those decisions were made, or was it simply around homophily, let's employ more people who look like the people we've already got, who we think do a good job, which is quite a human way of seeing the world, you know. If anyone here, I'm sure you all have ever recruited someone into a role in your team, the temptation is always someone who's a bit like you in some way. Oh, I was just like them when I started out, I can see myself in them. That's a bias, right? It's not necessarily wrong, but it's not coming from rational decision making. And rational decision making is something that systems can potentially do better than humans or differently to humans, let's say. Let's not call it better.
Yeah, I mean, I hold out great hope on that regard.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, I mean, any technologist who advances the humans are biased, so my system will be argument, should be drummed out of wherever they're working. You know, it's a disgrace. Bias is perfectly measurable, and systems must be designed to be unbiased.
Yeah.
If you look at all of the efforts on unbiased AI at the moment, the issue is basically people, firstly the repurposing argument. Systems that were never designed for a purpose have been used for something else.
Yeah.
That happens everywhere, but it was careless, particularly careless of Google. You know, it's one of the most technologically advanced companies on the planet. It's outrageous. But also, you have got a sort of Judith Butler issue as well, I think, which is the amount of intersectionality in a person. So you could probably cope with the protected characteristics in the UK. How many are there?
9.
6? 9? 9, okay. Some of them are difficult though. Religious persuasion, you know, that doesn't always manifest itself in data. But I don't know about other countries. So soon you run into this too many dimensions to be unbiased against issue. But you've got more hope of doing that in a data-driven sense, I think, than you have with PEEPs. Yeah. And we just give up trying to be unbiased against more than a few dimensions, and that's the basis of the trans debate, for example, isn't it? You've got a conflict of dimensions, and people don't know how to be unbiased on two axes. Yeah,
which occasionally can seem to be in conflict. Yeah, I think that's it, and you're right. You know, it's possible to build unbiased systems around a particular index, a particular sort of aspect that you're interested in. Like you say, the question is what happens when you start to aggregate all of those. So what I see now is we have potential to address known issues. So we can build application systems which will look at applications in a different way. For example, we might see more women, more ethnic minorities get through the selection process than if it was a human doing the filtering. We could build a system that could theoretically...
I find that also very interesting, because it's no good us being wishy-washy about what the dimensions of disadvantage are. You've got to be really precise about it, because when you're precise about it, then you can build systems that are unbiased. And I think that's a very interesting, that's another sort of really deep humanity type question, which is, well, what exactly are the dimensions? And are they equally important? And how could we be very precise about what those dimensions are? Because they clearly vary on context. So that's a really, you know, there's a lot to be done there. And it's not all just grim churning of the numbers, as people might think. I think a lot of it is understanding, being much more precise and much more clear-sighted about what humanity is.
Yeah, so there is a kind of an element of hope in the kind of use of AI there. So kind of my last big question as a philosopher is like this question about how this technology might change the way we think and the way we kind of see the world. I mean, after all, each technology done that historically. The standard sort of example is the washing machine. You might not think much of the washing machine, but it changed the way we do sort of laundry and the kind of whole sort of clothing industry and so on. So you might say, if the washing machine is doing that, not terribly smart. If with AI systems that can do things like maybe manage our biases, help us understand our biases better and kind of affect different, you might kind of actually think, okay, this question, which might seem intractable and a bit too broad, is it going to change? Maybe there are kind of ways more specific to kind of answer this question. Yes, AI will change the way we think and the way we behave in more specific ways. Maybe some ways we don't see yet, but some ways we can see. I mean, that's kind of partly what I hear from the consensus I was kind of emerging in your kind of last conversation. So kind of a bit more hopeful than the kind of standard scenario that, you know, we'll do all these sorts of, we'll release all the Teslas and kind of then...
see what chaos ensues.
Exactly. So there any sort of elements about kind of, you know, on this hopeful dimension, we can kind of end our conversation before inviting sort of questions from the audience?
So I'm sure you're absolutely right. I think there's great potential for modern AI to make you think carefully about what it is to be human, and I think that's a very good thing. But it won't be wishy-washy thinking, it has to be really focused and precise, more so than I can do. I thought it was there's a lot of studies at the moment talking about whether AI will put people out of jobs.
Oh yes, there is.
And there are two theorems. One of them is rather dull and has been around for ages, which is always the same, which is, oh, dreary manual jobs will be replaced by this wonderful computer, and that's always been said. But there's another. AI has the potential to affect different sorts of jobs, and they are rather dull but high stakes admin type jobs, and so the sort of jobs that I would not like to do, for making asylum decisions on people rapidly and fairly. Now, that's quite an interesting idea, that some of those jobs they're high stakes but also high volume, issuing parking tickets, perhaps that's a low stakes one, but so that really differentiates this industrial revolution from the previous ones. It hadn't occurred to me, for example, that and some jobs will be very much preserved. So skilled manual work, for example, is unlikely to be affected by AI, this generation of AI. So that's quite nice too. The axe doesn't just keep falling on one group of people. It's going to free up different sorts of activity.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would agree to some extent. I think, as you say, I think the narrative around, administrative, in inverted commas, or kind of low-skilled jobs will be the first to go is wrong in this case. I think what I find very interesting about this question is I can already see the human biases, if you like, in the adoption of AI in those kind of circumstances. My background is in publishing, and if you look at scholarly publishing, it would be absolutely and completely possible right now to eliminate any of the process of copy editing that is often done by humans right now. And I know companies that are working on doing this, but the problem is not the technology. Again, the problem is the weddedness to the systems that we have. And of course there are consequences to that, because those copy editors probably are not going to be able to go and do that job in any other industry either, because equally marketing, copywriting will be affected by AI and things like that. So I think there is potential, but again, I can see the constraints of the way that humans see the world. We have the right, I think, to make the decision that we think copy editing is a lovely thing that humans do beautifully, and we like it, and therefore we'd like to have people do it. We'd like to allow people the opportunity to do it. I think that's a debate that's not being had, though. I think there's just industries which are adopting these types of technologies because it's cost effective, or it can drive down their operating costs because it reduces their manufacturing errors or whatever it might be. And there are industries which are going, no, we are human and that is different. And what we do is different because we're a knowledge industry, or we're an industry, a media industry, a creative industry, whatever it might be. All of those are valid conversations, but I don't think they're happening in the right way at the moment. I think we simply are just getting this divergence between companies who are going, great, I can take some cost and risk out of my operations and therefore deliver greater shareholder value, or whatever their metrics are, usually shareholder value, let's be honest. And there are other companies going, we could do that, but we're not going to. We could take cost out of this process, but we're not going to. Now, the question is then, what's the consequence of that? So there are consequences for those individual copy editors who might keep their jobs for another year, 5 years, 10 years, maybe forever, if we just decide we don't want to let that artisan skill set die, because we're humans and we have these kind of ideas that things should be preserved. But equally, a lot of scholarly publishers are non-profits and charities. If that money was released, what could it be doing in the world? So to me, these are the interesting questions. So the answer is there an opportunity for positives? Yes, absolutely. And there's lots of ways in which, AI could change roles, it could change jobs, it could change industries. It could, for example, your point about the washing machine is a really good one, because the reality is most people in Silicon Valley working on AI systems are not women with 2 school-aged children who have to do the school run, who have to, I'm sure there are men here who change nappies and do all that good stuff, but statistically we know that this falls on women, right? And the kind of guys who, go on Twitter and say, I've just raised my $1 billion, a round, and here's my day. I get up at 5 and I do yoga for an hour, and then I have a smoothie, and then I go for a run, and then, these are not people who are dealing with practical household reality. So liberate people from those kinds of things could have lots of impacts on the world and the way that the world operates. So I think, again, it's, there isn't one answer, and what we need to be doing is bringing these conversations together. So it's not just technology can get rid of dreary manual jobs or do them better and safer, because, great if it's better and safer, that seems like a good thing, although, again, what's the consequences is another question. But this kind of resistance on the other side to AI because of the human way that we see the world, that's not necessarily going to stop AI changing. So if we're not engaging with that conversation across the board, I think we've got a problem, which takes us right back to the science and the humanities question, which is where I get very interested in this. I'm less interested in what the systems can do, although I think they have huge potential to de-bias and help us improve certain things that humans aren't very good at. But the question is, how do we feel about that, and what are we going to do about that, and what's the narrative that's going to emerge as these things change? If we could build technology that would replace all childcare responsibilities, for example, you could give your baby to a robot and it gives it back at the age of 18, fully formed, and whatever, would we choose that? I don't have children, so I don't have a view, but you see my point. The reality is, if that technology existed, we could liberate women across the world from the kind of physical tasks that keep them in the home at the moment in many parts of the world and here. But
I actually kind of want to this sort of note, kind of a bit provocative about whether technology should go and do that, and kind of invite questions from the audience. And we can don't need to kind of be bound to the questions we proposed about kind of error, can be kind of wider about AI, maybe any sort of curiosity about how AI works, kind of more about the future of AI. We'd be happy to answer your questions. Yes, I think we should have some microphones for kind of audience.
Hi, I'd like to know what the philosopher answers are to the question the philosopher poses.
Oh, thank you for putting me on the spot. So, I think, as Richard was saying, he kind of very trustworthy, he thinks I'm right about the fact that AI is going to change thought and behavior. I think it has the potential in the kind of this sort of sense of putting out there these standards of precision. So when this kind of questions about explainability of AI, we kind of seem to want to say, look, we need to understand exactly and explain exactly how the system got to make this sort of decision, playing Go and so on. And I just feel, okay, but why are we asking that question? It's just so then we can kind of motivate a law and so on. For me as a philosopher, why we are asking that question is so we kind of understand better what standards for rationality can be. Like, we keep on talking about being kind of reasonable in a certain way or kind of being intelligent in a certain way. But I think there are like lots of things about kind of standards that we can learn by asking these sorts of questions. So one reason I would be interested to understand why a system make a certain decision to win a chess move or to kind of do something else more creative is for me to see how those standards that the machine applied differ from all our theories about kind of reason and so on. And then kind of maybe come up with new standards for kind of humans. So in that sense, kind of I think there is a sort of learning sort of curve here, like from machines back to humans. I think, yeah, that would be the process.
Maybe I didn't make this as elegantly as I should have made it, but philosophy, I don't know what you feel like as philosophers, but you're about to come into the spotlight of technology, my friends. And it's going to be pretty hot for you, because I think the questions I'm asking of machines are basically philosophical questions, and they often start with me saying, well, I wonder what humans do then. And then there's the more general philosophical question, which is, well, ignore humans. You know, what is the right and wrong answer to this? What is rationality, and how should it be applied in these machines? We never had to bother with those questions when we were just dealing with on-off systems, which were little more than on-off switches. But we're about to. So get ready is what I would say to you. I mean, it's not accidental that, okay, this is not the same reason, but both Google and Facebook, and I think all the big five now have ethicists on their staff.
Yeah.
The Facebook one didn't last very long. But,
because it's tricky, right?
So that's a sort of trivial example, but they certainly weren't underpaying. So it's about to become quite a hot topic if it isn't already.
Yeah, I agree, and I think this, and I think I said this to Maria, but I think not only are we going to see ethicists and philosophers involved in these kinds of conversations, but we're going to see novelists, we're going to see all sorts of different ways of thinking about the world and constructing the world, because in essence that's what we're saying. How is AI going to construct the world? Well, that's a question for people who think about how to construct a world that we can believe in and what makes that believable.
But it will have to be precise interaction. So and yet another essay from an academic saying, woe is me, ChatGPT is a disaster and the end of a known universe. That isn't a contribution.
No, absolutely not.
The contribution is, in that example, to separate out very precisely what we mean by the argumentation in a piece, which is often poor with ChatGPT, and the way it's presented, which is often not good, but it's acceptable.
Yeah.
There was another question from
I just wanted to hear your general thoughts on the use of AI to manage societies, civilizations. So if you could program an AI to run a society effectively so that everyone's lives had meaning and they didn't destroy the planet and the planet didn't destroy them. I just wanted to hear some general thoughts from any of you on that topic.
better politics. So AI-driven politics. Any thoughts, anyone?
What a delightful idea. Yeah. So if you're going to design a machine learning system, I'm going to grossly trivialise hundreds of years of work here, but firstly you need an error metric. You've got to decide what is good and what the target is for your system. So would that be decided by the people who are programming the AI? Almost always, yeah. There is some work on meta systems that themselves create targets, but the target might not be quite so obvious. If we think about some of the current successes, I'm sure you've seen these synthetic humans that people have generated, or what was it? The portrait of Edmund de Bellamy, wasn't it? Which was the first. It sold for about $25,000. It was completely computer generated. These generative AIs, the way the error works there is they build a critic who says good, bad, right? And they build something that just generates lots and lots of examples, and they just run it gazillion times around, and the critic, eventually you stop and you say, well, the critic says that's all right. What's it look like? Oh, it looks quite good. It just looks like a human.
Yeah.
But you've still got you've got the critic in there embodying the error. So right back at you, the answer is, if you would care to tell me what constitutes a good civilization and a good society, then we can build an AI to build it. Certainly, AI and computer science can help model it, and that's the basis of of artificial civilizations and A-life and all that sort of stuff. But the real question, you cannot be evaded, which is what the heck constitutes a reasonable civilization? So these questions, I think, are brought into much sharper relief when you can do the handle turning of generating civilizations like that instead of 20 years.
It will turn out this series will convince everyone that philosophers should be in charge, which would, since Plato, we are trying to save the world. So, because in a way, kind of your question, the way Richard picked it up is like, what is the theory for the perfect sort of world, the perfect society that or kind of not contain any biases. You have many a political philosopher imagining that. And then many other political philosophers coming and saying, you're not right because there is another error in the system. So these sort of ideal theories have been in the job of philosophy for a very long time. One interesting question is, what would an AI system do with one of these ideal sort of? So what would you want the AI system to do, this sort of, let's check that kind of philosophical theory. How would the world look? Or would you want your AI system to prescribe and then kind of the people to follow? So it's a bit... So it's kind of, what do we want them to do? To kind of, run through our theories and kind of spot maybe mistakes in what we saw in ideal theories? Or would we want to say, this is the ideal theory, we are kind of this club of philosophy experts, we think this is the best, we need the AI system to implement this. So there are kind of different sort of uses there.
So you could, the modern approach might be to build a series of critics that sort of understood each one of these philosophical ideas about civilization, and it sat saying, I don't like that one, but I like that one. And so long as it gets an error measure and you've got enough time, you will generate something. It's not explainable. It's like the portrait of Edmund de Bellamy. You think, it's pretty good. Wonder how it generated that then? No idea. It was one of a million that we tried, and we like this one the best.
Yeah. There is a question in the back.
Thank you. I thought the point about what kind of society was very relevant, because what struck me throughout the conversation was the assumption that, the world is as it is, and that's how it is, and we have to live with Google and Facebook, horrible they may be. We have to live with Tesla cars because we're addicted to cars and we don't know a way out of it. Surely the bigger question is, what kind of world do we want to live in, and how might AI fit into it? Rather than, we've got AI, what are we going to do about it?
Yeah, could I say something there?
Of course.
What a delight to hear a voice of optimism. Yeah, and quite a few of the messes that we've talked about have actually arisen by precisely that attitude, which is some graduate student somewhere has produced this wonderful system, and before we know it, it's sitting in Tesla. God knows how we ended up with Teslas with deep learning in the image recognition system. It was an accident waiting to happen. And even more horrifying, I gather the system turns itself off 30 milliseconds before killing anyone so that the blame doesn't sit with the AI.
Yeah.
I mean, how horrifying is that? So I agree with the sentiment of what you're saying, so I couldn't agree more. I don't have anything more wise to say other than, what a good idea. Codifying what sort of society we want to live in, of course I like that very much as a computer scientist. That appeals immediately to my...
my thought was that our current society represents an existential threat to our continued existence. We are failing to do anything about climate change. It's going to change anyway, and it might change for a hell of a lot worse.
Yeah, I think, climate change is a really good example, but as were your comments about, Google, Facebook, they just exist, we've got to live with them. You're absolutely right that that's not the, that's a way of viewing the world, but we could also, as a society, say, we don't want these organisations which are, whatever the individual motivations of the people who work there, many of whom will be interested in these questions and thinking about these questions. The reality is they are there to deliver shareholder value because that's the structure in which they exist. So the question for me there is similar to one that you were asking, I think. If we could design our way out of that, what would that look like, and what role would AI have in that? That I don't know the answer to, but I think these are the kind of questions that we need to be asking of AI in that context. What are we building the world that we want, or are we building the world that continues the path that we're already on, for better or worse in various different ways? And of course that speaks to bias and things like that. It speaks to all sorts of different things. But yeah, I think as always the challenge is, how do we define what it is that we want, and how do we also have a narrative around that which can counteract the very powerful narratives that exist in the system that we have already, like companies should make money. I mean, you know, it's always been my question to economists, what happens if an economy just stops growing for a year and redistributes everything it already has? And of course, that's not really an economic question, it's a philosophical question in a sense. But the reality is, you know, those are the systems that we have in many cases at the moment. So what could AI, I think the question for me is, could AI have a role in helping us to change those narratives and challenge that, you know, these companies, this idea that climate change isn't real or isn't as serious as people say it is, or, you know, whatever all the narratives are around that. What can AI do to contribute to changing that narrative, I think is the way I would think. I don't have an answer, but I think it's a question that's really worth thinking. So I think it was a great question, very thought-provoking.
Yes?
Do you think that actually AI is just so human, so like humans, because it's so subject to bias in the same way humans are? Because it depends on the data. If the data isn't unbiased, it will be, you know, it will have a bias in it. And that's just what humans do. We just work on restricted data sets.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have the potential to make decisions around that. So we have the potential to think, let's interrogate the data sets that we have and think about the biases that might exist in there and think about how we might build that into the modelling that we're doing. So is our success criteria for this system that it can replicate a decision a human would make, or is it that it can make a different decision with some of those biases challenged, for example? I've lost my thread. Richard, step in.
I was just thinking about human bias, which comes in many forms, doesn't it? So there's the bias that one is aware of, which presumably you can correct. Yep. And there's the bias that you're unaware of, and that's difficult to correct, but slow thinking can sometimes sort of just bring that. And then there's the horrible bias, which is bias that somebody is aware of, but they conceal. You know, so they're maliciously sort of feeding their own bias. You don't get a lot of that in academia, but you know, it's around in society. And the good thing about AI is that you can, in principle, get rid of the malice. You know? There's another question here about malicious AI, but let's not go there. So, although the data does drive bias, you can monitor it quite neatly with computers. You can control against it, and you can look for deception, probably a little bit easier than you can with humans. So there's some reason to be hopeful about biased AI, although data is always the problem with us neural machines.
Yeah, I just remembered the other thing I was going to say to your point, which was, is AI so similar to humans that it's going to replicate those biases? I think, again, I go back to, you know, the human conception of what it is to be human. I don't think AI is very close to that in all sorts of ways, because, you know, your point about the stop signs, your example about the stop signs, it's shocking to us because it seems so obvious which of those are really stop signs and which aren't. And it's very jarring for us to see something which seems human but has this very big discrepancy to the way that humans see the world. So if any of you saw, talking about generative images, there was that image, you know, one of these tools was asked to generate an image of a woman reading. And when you first look at it, it sort of looks okay. It's a woman, obviously highly sexualized, because that's the data sets that we train our AI on. Women are sexual creatures and float around in meadows with long blonde hair and all that kind of stuff. But it's a woman sitting in a meadow reading, and at first glance, it kind of, okay, that bit cheesy, but it seems like something someone could have drawn or whatever. It seems okay. But when you look at it, she's actually got like 9 different books on her lap and all sorts of slightly weird things. And that's very, very jarring experience as a human, because it just looks to us so obviously wrong that you wouldn't, you know, not you would never draw that, but the likelihood of a human drawing that, because it looks so disturbing and so sort of confronting, is quite low. And that's where, you know, AI doesn't look human. In that sense, it's not very close to what it feels like to be human. And those are visual examples, but if you take that concept, how close is AI to humans? Maybe it's not that close.
Well, I think that another effect we haven't talked about is the uncanny valley. Okay, so probably people know about the uncanny valley, but as you get quite close to human performance, these what are quite small errors really jar, and the result looks weird or alien. And of course, research scientists, we love working in the uncanny valley because you get this very big change in performance. You make a small adjustment and things change a lot.
Yeah.
And it's the fact that research systems are in the uncanny valley doesn't mean that production systems should be.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we seem to have got into this, let's just download some teenager down. Actually, there's a great joke, which I will say. So I'm sure you've heard about data mining.
Yeah.
Data mining, is a form of statistics. My friend protests vigorously nowadays that everything we worked on as kids can just be downloaded by, a teenager and replicated. PyTorch or something, you just download it and run it. And he refers to these people as data miners.
Okay.
It's because they're small. Perhaps it wasn't that good a joke. I liked it. It was a computer scientist.
It was a data joke, not everyone's cup of tea.
The point is, they're using very sophisticated technology, but they haven't had 4 years of training on bootstrap versus cross-validation techniques and the bias variance trade-off and all the things that you have to do when you want to check that the system's really working properly. So there's an issue there, which is these systems are being used in weird ways.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping that it will stop. Maybe the AI Act in the EU will stop it, but I doubt it.
But this question of the similarity, I don't know if I'm projecting my voice, but this question of the similarity between humans and AI is kind of a bit built into how we started imagining AI. So it's kind of the imitation game. So we deem AI systems good enough if they match us. And if we're not perfect, we're going to deem them good enough when they match also our errors. And maybe, so in a way, kind of maybe there's something there to reconsider. So this is kind of related also to questions about how an ideal society would look and why do we want to kind of keep on building AI systems that, accept all the problems that we have in our world rather than building them in a much more visionary way, kind of changing the world and so on. Maybe because we take the imitation game too seriously in AI systems.
Yeah, it's a nightmare. So the Turing test, which is the imitation game, I think, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a complete nightmare because if you've ever tried to do it, you spend hours trying to build dialogue systems that make mistakes like humans typing.
Exactly.
Oh, God, what a waste of time that is.
Yeah.
Oh, and it's a drag. It's a mental model for how you might tell general intelligence.
Yeah,
but what I've been talking about is understanding very carefully what the task is that humans do, characterize it, and then build a system that meets the task objectives. I hope and expect it will not act like humans. That's a nightmare.
Any other questions? Yes?
A couple of
Thank you. Those of us of a certain age will remember when we first came across the Sinclair Cambridge four-function calculator. I was exactly, and it's amazing to me in one lifetime how things have progressed. And we read about this. Is it the singularity where there'll come a point where AI will won't need us to program it? It will become self-programming. Now it's just like nuclear fission. It's always 30 years in the future. It'll never happen. Or does it keep you awake at night wondering whether, in one lifetime we've got from the Sinclair Cambridge to now another lifetime with the growth? Where will it end up, really?
Yeah, that's a quick one, isn't it? Yeah, my iPhone's more powerful than a Cray 1X XMP, so that's pretty good going, isn't it? What was your question?
Does it keep you awake?
No.
No.
Look, there was a joke we always used to say, which is when you're on the news, I've been on the news a few times talking about little technological developments, and when it's really close, you say, be ready in 5 years. And when there's no chance of being ready, you say, 10 years from now, something will be happening. 10 years is a lifetime. And as you pointed out, it's usually 30. So It doesn't keep me awake. The people who seem to write very lucidly about the singularity are, I've noticed, people who are very brilliant people. They're clearly, so clever, and they're very inspirational thinkers, but they're not very insightful about why they're very brilliant. And for reasons that I cannot quite put my finger on, they are very exercised about the singularity. But none of them have ever built a machine learning system. So Roger Penrose's book, which is a great read, I've met Roger Penrose, and I asked him, have you ever built a neural network? And he said, oh no, I don't know how to program. And I thought, well, listen, mate, I mean, you're imagining something that is unimaginable to me. So I'm waiting for someone who works in AI to worry about singularity, not our great thinkers, because I think they're reading far too much into their own brilliance, into me and machines.
Yep, there was another question, I think there, yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of a similar one, but where do you actually kind of see AI within the next kind of 30 to 50 years?
5 years.
Go with
10.
I don't know. You answer this one. I don't know.
I don't know. I mean, I do think that, I do hope, let's be optimistic and put our faith in humanity, which we've been very dismissive of this evening. I think that humanity has some difficult questions to answer about AI and what role it wants technology to play in the future. And, technology encompasses more than AI, but AI is, probably going to keep becoming a bigger and bigger proportion of what we're talking about when we talk about technology. I think that we will have to have some of these conversations around what we want the technology to do for us. And the people that need to be having those conversations are not just programmers and not just computer scientists. That's the really critical thing. And again, I don't come from a programming background. I mean, I come, I can do statistics and things like that, so I can understand, some of the concepts which we're talking about here. But I really feel very strongly that one of the challenges we've got in the UK at the moment is this divide that's being drawn between technology and the humanities. The whole, her next job could be in cyber to the poor old ballet dancer who was just there being a brilliant ballet dancer. What's the point of her? What she should be doing is learning to code. And that's a really dangerous narrative, I think. So I think everybody needs to be in this conversation, whether you're a computer scientist, whether you're a philosopher, whether you're a novelist, whether you just don't really know what AI is, but you think you want to know a bit more about it, and maybe the narrative that you get about the big scary machines is not the full story. I think it's a conversation everybody should be in, and I think that's how we get to a place where we harness the potential of AI to solve human problems without, all of these, ghosts in the machine taking over the world and doing things that we somehow can't control.
Yeah, but I think it's kind of, just to jump in quickly, I think it's a very hard question because imagination, and in the last sort of event of the series, we'll kind of try to tackle that question. It's imagination seems to give us, if you're under freedom, imagine the unimaginable, that sort of thing. So, but you just feel that, but there surely has to be constraints. You need to know how to program one of these machines so you can kind of pronounce what this sort of machine can do. Even if maybe you cannot, see into its future, you cannot, but, kind of one, let's call it kind of with a big word, danger of kind of people announcing the end of the world via AI from now. It's you have this unconstrained use of imagination over a system we understand very little of. We know very little of because we don't interact with it as much. So I think this sort of it's a difficult question because it supposes that we have to have these sorts of answers like what sort of constraints should we kind of impose when we want to imagine what's going to happen in 5 years and 10 years? How much of these constraints should come from our knowledge of the systems and how much of our kind of vision for a future? So it's kind of hard to provide a blanket answer without getting into all these questions before.
Okay, let me say something vaguely serious because it's it's an unanswerable question. A long time ago, I wanted to start a school at UEA called the School of Futures.
Okay.
And I couldn't get anyone interested in it. And I think it's a pity, because I think the study of the future is amenable to careful thought. And I think there are people who do it quite well, particularly for fashion, which is, there's high stakes on predicting fashion futures. It's short prediction, but it's a prediction. And it's some time since the UK government has done a futurology exercise thinking about what 30 years will look like. We used to do it very systematically, and we used to be good at science futures in this country, and it used to be done in a very careful way, and it was a big help to the research environment, to junior researchers, because you knew what was coming. And it's time to do it again.
That's a good
And could we have a School of Futures?
Yes. And can we have humanities people in there as well?
But they always are in it. Such schools are always very interdisciplinary, as you can imagine.
Yeah. No, it sounds great. I'm in.
2 questions in the back. Okay. Yeah, William. Okay, good.
Yeah, thank you very much for the conversation, first of all, because, it was really interesting. I guess I've got a couple of questions, really. One is, you talked about the big 5 companies, and they're obviously venture capitalists. And so their funding is, relatively speaking, transparent. Are there other AI systems being developed from different places? Where does the funding come from for them? And do you see governments getting involved either upfront about their funding for AI systems, or I suppose the other aspect of it is, is there an arms race, and I use that terminology deliberately, that we don't know about in terms of AI that's going on? Thank you.
Do you want me to?
I think you're probably best placed to take that one.
So I disagree with one of the tenets of your question, I think, which is a lot of these companies are venture funded, So that doesn't mean they're really very public at all. I mean, really, a lot of this is privately held capital. So they might go public, but there's a lot of government interest in AI, and it's no accident that a lot of very good Israeli companies in AI, a lot of them funded by the government. We spend a lot of money on this for national security purposes. Now, I don't know how alarmed you are by that. I mean, for me, it's just been part of my life that there are roughly 800 computer science professors in the UK, I think. Facebook at the moment, when I last looked, which was last year, they had over 800 vacant positions for research, PhD research level scientists, essentially professors, paid 2 or 3 times what I'm paid. So there's vast commercial input into the intellectual base of computer science in this country. Always has been like that. Doesn't freak me out, but I'm always surprised when people don't know about it. So if that was your question, sir, the extent to which there is commercial involvement and it's being driven by commercial imperative, then the commercial imperative here is very, very strong indeed. It's venture funding, so it's red in tooth and claw. And I am too blasé about it because it's been like that my whole life. I don't know if we would care to disagree or agree with that. But.
I think the question about is there an in inverted commas arms race around AI is quite an interesting one.
Yes, there is.
And there is, and I'm sure you could talk much more coherently than me about that. But again, I think what's interesting is the narrative again. Is it an arms race, or is it a race for the good of humanity, or is it something else entirely? What defines an arms race? I guess in an AI
bad people
world.
Think AI will help them do bad things, and good people think it will do good things. And there are good arms races and bad arms races. So no great answer there, I'm afraid. But AI is certainly in the hands of evil people. No question about that.
Yeah, and there certainly is that race as well. across different countries and so on.
There was perhaps, yeah?
Sorry, I'm just a little unsure of what you see as the real difference between humans and AI. Is it just quantitative, or what is specifically does it mean to be human as opposed to be AI?
Yeah, I was hoping you would tell me that, because that's not my area of expertise. I don't specialise, I don't work on humans.
We've been talking about the difference.
Yeah.
What do you think the difference is? If there is one, or isn't one?
Well, I'm an advocate of what's usually called the strong AI position. So I don't see a difference between humans and computers. I see them as this machine up here is a meat machine that takes inputs and produces outputs. So that's my view, right? And it disturbs me, therefore, that I don't have a programming manual for the meat machine, and it disturbs me that my specifications weren't laid out by philosophers and others long ago. So that is my position, which I would certainly regard, I'm sure most of the audience would regard as wildly extreme and mechanistic. So I'm not sure I have it. That's not a fantastic answer. Somebody else
I'm going to provide several positions without kind of revealing mine on this. One sort of view that very often is put forward that would make the difference is kind of thinking about AlphaGo and thinking about what happened to AlphaGo when it won. Feel anything? Was it satisfied in any particular way? Think about the human in the same position beating AlphaGo or kind of not letting. It seems that the emotional dimension of the human, for most people, would make the difference because those systems, as we evaluate them now, we are ready to say they don't feel anything. They don't feel that spark. They don't feel the satisfaction. And that's, for some, what kind of makes us human. We kind of get this sort of, kind of this layer. Yeah.
How do you know that AlphaGo doesn't have emotions?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, AlphaGo was delighted because its error had gone to zero, and that's the definition of orgasmic delight to machines like AlphaGo.
Exactly. So I had a caveat there in my answer. As we kind of think that we evaluate these sort of things concerning emotions, having a certain sort of bodily response and so on, that's how so we use the standard of humans to say they don't feel emotions. I didn't say that I'm sure they don't feel emotions, but kind of using certain sort of standards about the sort of biological machine in which we are is very often kind of the way to answer this is what kind of makes us human. But kind of the questions tonight kind of picked up this sort of idea that we would want to live in a world kind of that would be ideal in some way, that wouldn't have these sort of problems. And if we as humans, we use that standard, we want to live in that sort of world rather than deal with the mess that we continuously create, then we are not so different from machines. Machines will have like specifications manuals and kind of the ideal world. So again, it kind of depends a bit what kind of the standard you want to build for humans and kind of build for the machines. As a philosopher, I don't think we can go full on for a kind of a completely satisfactory answer, but as Nancy's pointed out kind of this evening, having a conversation about this, like what do we think it makes us human, kind of testing it. Is it about kind of the emotions that we feel and pushing back them, can enrich our understanding rather than kind of being dogmatic. Machines are definitely different or humans are different. So the point of the comparison is to kind of in a way kind of have the conversation rather than kind of provide a sort of answer. This is what we think being human is, and this is what kind of we think machine is.
There have been several people who've designed machines that feel pain, but it's all a bit symbolic. You just change the names of a variable, call it pain, and that will do.
Yeah.
I guess it would be fun to design one that had some human emotion in it.
Do you mind if I just, I don't know if you can hear me, but I'll give more of a transpersonal spiritual perspective, if you don't mind. I was contemplating this earlier Hello, thank you. And what came forward was the earliest of stories, or some of the earliest stories, which is Genesis 1. Just a concept in the beginning when mystery created the cosmos, and the cosmos was without form and shape, with darkness over the abyss and a mighty wind sweeping over the waters. The mystery said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And the mystery said it was good. So if we consider what the abyss is, as consciousness, as a field of consciousness beyond our physical being, and we tap in as humans into this consciousness in all form. Some people can start measuring it, some scientists are starting to call it the noosphere and things like this, but overall the difference going forward with AI, we feed it, and it will understand love, it will understand pain, it will understand all forms of senses, for sure. And it will outsource our brain, for sure. It will supersede our brain. But the creative aspect of human, which comes from the abyss, the water of the abyss, which has all creation is from, will always be our unique understanding of beingness, our unique consciousness will always be fed by that abyss. So that makes us different. So yes, AI will end up mirroring back to us what humanity is, which Richard is asking, what is it to be? And the AI will end up telling us, but unfortunately, when it's in the hands of power, greed, and profit, it's going to be, and I love that data miners, lots of data miners, it's going to be a slow, quite painful process, but we will get there, and we will see our humanity of the beautiful creation that we are. Thank you.
There was another sort of comment, yeah, in the room.
Thank you. I was going to say, in the more hopeful elements of the evening, we were talking about how AI might be able to make more rational decisions than humans can, perhaps in terms of eliminating bias and that kind of thing. But what I was wondering was, can that go too far? Is that desirable? If we strip all sort of emotion and empathy out of decision making, is that a good thing? Is actually the most rational conclusion the most desirable conclusion?
It's a fantastic question and really, really interesting. And I think, again, for me, all of this comes down to the choices that we want to make as a society and as individuals. So, I was just, from the various discussions we've been having this evening and the questions that have been coming up, I was thinking that the interesting thing about the answer to the question, what makes someone human, is that everybody in this room has a slightly different definition of that. So it might be emotion. But for me, I would say one of the things that defines humanity is having a moral code, whatever that is. So what I would say is, I think from a moral perspective, that we have to work to reduce bias in order to improve equity, in order to give people the chance to have a meaningful life, a purposeful life, in whatever terms they define that, assuming the moral code is one that we can sign up to. So I think you're right to say, is the most rational decision desirable, is a good question. I think the answer is, the irrational decisions are so fucking awful, excuse my French, so awful at the moment, that I'm interested to see what the rational decisions would be and what the consequences of that would be, because we know that we're not very good at this, and a lot of bias does exist, and it has real world implications for people who are likely to die younger, who are likely to, be poor and disadvantaged in retirement, whatever metrics you might be applying to that. These biases have real world consequences. So my take on it, for what it's worth, would be, let's make a really rational set of decisions and see what happens. And of course, Richard will then say, how do you define what's the rational outcome? But if we were able to strip that bias out and say, okay, everyone in this room has applied for a job, and a system will make a rational decision about who's the best person to do that job, I would be really interested to see how that plays out in that organisation 5, 10 years down the line. And is it better or worse than what we've done? Which is pretty poor in many cases. So I haven't necessarily answered your question about whether the rational decision is desirable, but I think it's something that we can't currently test, and we don't currently understand what that would look like, and it would be an interesting data point, apart from anything else, to know.
Yeah, I see where you're coming from. I hadn't given it much thought until you... It's certainly true that some of the most spectacular sort of examples of AI at the moment seem to be a bit emotionless. You know, they're lacking in anima, aren't they? You know, ChatGPT was the one we were talking about, you know, which is this system for writing essays, really. It's a student's dream. But they're rubbish essays. They're really boring, you know. And then there's the Armus, which is a composer that passes the test of, you know, professional music critics can't really tell it apart from humans. But the music is, I think, is a bit spiritless and a bit uninteresting, and then there's portraiture and so on. But it's lacking this sort of emotional spark. There are people working on affective computing, though. And the one, I'll tell you one example, because this is fun. And it's weird, it's probably... So we were working on a system that... it takes a lot of bandwidth to send all those pixels down your Zoom call. So wouldn't it be nice if I reconstructed a synthetic version of you, my end, which I can do quite cheaply, and then I'll just have a camera at my end, and I'll look at all of your emotions, and I'll just send signals down to drive the avatar, my end. So it's photorealistic, so I won't really tell it's not you. And in fact, it is you in some sense. It's a model that looks just like you being driven by you. Okay, so far so good. Then I can't remember if we did this on purpose or by accident, but I think it was accident. So in order to test these, we had lots of people looking at these things, and we asked, you know, are they personable, all of that. And we asked a whole load of subsidiary questions, you know, and one of them was, what is the sexuality of the person? I don't know why we asked that question, but we did. Anyway, by accident, we drove the male model with female signals from a female subject, and we drove the female model from the signals from a male subject. And everyone said, these look incredibly camp. It was, we sort of crossed the wires. And it sort of occurred to me that maybe some of the things that we interpret very intimately with emotion and feeling are actually just a bit of crossed wiring in the transmission system. So that was a long way of saying that although I find it very, you know, emotions and the way I feel I'm interacting with someone are extremely powerful effects and very attractive. Maybe if we knew a bit more about them, then we could understand the wiring diagram a bit better of emotions, and that would make our systems more usable and chip away at our understanding of what emotions are and what purpose they serve, because that is another really fascinating sort of biological question. That wasn't very elegantly put, that story. But what I'm trying to say is it's an underexplored part of computer science, and I wish we could work more on it.
Yes, there are two questions in front.
To what extent do you think that the metaphors used in the descriptions of artificial intelligence obscure the ways in which they actually work? So, in the sense that there are quite a lot of biological metaphors that are used, such as neural network, or those that resemble how we talk about humans, so learning or training. My view is that AI can never recreate consciousness, because fundamentally we don't understand what consciousness is. It is the hard problem of philosophy. And so my view is that it does obscure that and present it as something that it isn't. But I'm interested to know what your views are.
Yeah, well, I 100% agree with you, and I probably added to the confusion this evening, because it's always annoying when somebody is using words that most people use one way in a very technical way, and of course that's what I've been doing when I talk about training and testing and all those sorts of things. Absolutely right. So wouldn't it be nice if there were no biological metaphors in machine learning at all? Oh God, yeah. Yeah. I was never really into neural networks. I've just been forced into them because they're so good. By neural, I don't mean our neural networks, I mean artificial neural networks. Yes, it's a strong annoyance, and it causes all sorts of confusion and aggro. And yes, I agree about with consciousness as well.
Yeah, I think I agree as well. Like, I think a lot of the metaphors and a lot of the narratives around AI are unhelpful in all sorts of ways, either by clouding what we should really be talking about, or, you know, as you say, sort of confusing technical ways of viewing things.
It has been a deliberate choice, I should say. It's not an accident that... so in order to raise money, you need something that sounds good to investors. So it's not an accident, for example, the current type of neural networks are known as deep neural networks. Now, why aren't they just neural networks? We had neural networks in the 80s. I remember going to the first neural network conference. Why are they called... And by the way, they were called artificial neural networks.
Yeah.
And before we knew it, they became neural networks. And then when they didn't work, we called them neural not-works. You know. And then, why did they become deep? Well...
Several layers.
Because they have several layers, but it also implies profound. Yeah. It also implies
something slightly spiritual.
Another way of chiseling money out of venture capitalists, I think. You know, there's quite a lot of spin in these terms.
Yeah, and just on that point, I'm sure many of you, if you're interested in AI, might already know about this, but there's a really interesting organisation called We and AI who are looking at some of these questions. You've probably come across them.
No, I haven't.
No, yeah. So anyway, one of the projects that they've done, they're a non-profit, and what they're really interested in is trying to sort of get underneath the narratives around AI and help people to understand AI so that these conversations can continue with a broader kind of input from society as a whole, rather than, you know, people who are very knowledgeable. And one of the projects that they've been working on is trying to encourage different imagery for when we talk about AI. So, you know, the classic article in the press will have either a robot-looking human or a human-looking robot, or it might have, like, lots of connections that are a bit glowy and, you know, a bit sci-fi. And what they're trying to do is encourage people to use different visual metaphors for AI, but I absolutely think that they will move on to looking at, you know, the linguistic metaphors and stuff like that as well. So go and check out their image bank if you're writing about AI, because you can avoid having, oh, I'm a slightly human robot or a slightly robotic human. But B, also their website has got lots of interesting resources thinking about these kinds of questions.
Yeah, it's a complete nightmare. I mean, but obviously one way to study consciousness would be to build an artificial brain and to see if you could stimulate consciousness. It's a perfectly legitimate research approach, and nothing wrong with it. But you know, as soon as you do it, we'll have a headline about scientists build artificial brain.
Frankenstein brain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hello?
Hi, yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. To go back to the bias point again, sorry to keep bringing it up, but there's been talk about opportunity for AI in a hiring position to maybe potentially not have a bias, maybe increase the quality that way. But conversely, surely the mass deployment of AI in a society without regulation of AI is going to put a lot of people out of a job, because there's some jobs that an AI can maybe do better than a human. So that will induce unemployment in the population in a biased way that affects some people more than others. So does AI represent a net opportunity or a net threat to equality, do you think?
Ooh, that's a fantastic question. I'm going to take the optimist view and say a net opportunity, because we're having these conversations. You know, people in this room may not all be computer scientists. You know, that to me means that we have already seen that there's a potential and a risk here, and we want to have the debate around that risk versus that potential. So, you know, you're absolutely right that AI could eliminate some jobs, but the point is could. As a society, we could say we choose for that not to be the outcome, or we choose to build a society in which having a job is not a defining, you know, feature of being human, or whatever it might be. But these are the questions that will not be solely decided by computer scientists and people building AI systems, and that's where I think we've got an opportunity for a net positive. So I wouldn't say it's in the bag, but I would say let's keep having these conversations, and we've got a better chance of getting there.
And your view of employment, which is mine, you know, which is jobs are basically a good thing, is quite a modern one, remember. You know, I mean, I looked at this, and some time ago, mechanisation was going to be the saviour of humanity, and we wouldn't have to work 5 days a week. Well, it's sort of, we're getting there. I mean, there are a few companies now operating 4 days a week. I'm dreaming of the day when UEA is working 2 days a week. So, if we could get to that wonderful position, then AI is a good thing.
Yeah. And again, these are choices we can make. You know, everyone works 1 day a week, 2 days a week, 3 days a week. We do different jobs, or you know, AI does different aspects. The important point is having the debate, not letting the path that we're on dictate the future that we end up in.
A final question? Yes.
You mentioned earlier on about the stories around AI, and I wanted to ask, what's your opinion on the representation of AI in fiction? So characters like Data in Star Trek, or Hal in 2001, and how would you like to see AI represented?
My answer to that would be a simple one, which is what's amazing and wonderful about fiction is that it allows you to imagine any extent of villainy and any extent of heroism and everything in between. So, you know, I did my PhD on literature, and I wrote about Margaret Atwood, and she said, you know, we'll have reached gender equality when we can write about women being every bit as bad and evil as men without that being, you know, viewed differently. And I think for me the same is true of AI. So, you know, you could say a character like Hal is very simplistic, you know, drive for its own survival in a sense, in the way that film's constructed. I don't know much about Star Trek, so I can't comment on Data, but the point is fiction allows us to explore all of these things. So I'm cool with us having depictions of AI in fiction which may not be absolutely representative of what happens in the world, because that's how we explore what we want the world to be, in my opinion. It allows us to go, but if it was like that, what would that be like? And if it went in that direction, what would we feel about that, and how would we react? So, you know, there are certainly problems, but there's problems with the way everything's depicted in fiction, you know, and we know that, and we can make our own judgments around that. So, yeah, I don't. That doesn't keep me awake at night. I think it's important that we just keep saying, is that realistic? Is that going to happen? Rather than, is that a good or bad depiction of what we currently have? That's my answer.
It's very common to find computer scientists with an intimate knowledge of sci-fi, well, all fiction. You know, I know you think of us as completely emotionless and uninteresting people who don't have a cultural life, but that's absolutely, completely wrong. It's incredibly motivating for a number of scientists, these the sort of people you've mentioned. You know, the epitome of either evil computers or beautiful computers, or you know, wonderfully creative AIs and all those sorts of things. So, although I hate them, they are massively important, culturally important to computer science. So we should acknowledge that at least.
Diplomatic.
Thank you so much for kind of joining us today. We hope many of you will continue this conversation about how we should shape kind of science more generally, if not only AI as individuals and as societies. For the next event, which is going to be next week, we're going to kind of talk under this sort of very big title, Science for the People. We'll kind of try to figure out what that means, the umbrella, like similar questions, and we'll keep the same sort of format, inviting you to kind of be part of our conversation, continue our conversation in the Q&A. Hopefully, you'll be able to join us. Thank you so much to Richard and Nancy for joining us today, and thank you so much for you and for all of your questions. Thank you.
Thanks.